Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Behind the Pulse. Vinny Camo here. I'm super excited to talk with my guest today, Chantal Reeder. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I know you have done a lot of really exciting work in the music industry, so I'm super glad we connected. You not only have a background working with some major PR companies, but also doing work with artist management. So I really want to get into that stuff and kind of dive deep into your experiences. I suppose it'd be easiest if we start at the beginning, and maybe you could start with talking about your transition from working at a tech company to going more into the PR side of things.
Absolutely. So I started off my career over at Dell Computers at the headquarters. I was on campus as a senior account manager, primarily dealing with medium sized businesses, helping set up their infrastructure and whatnot. It was my first job in corporate America, and it was really, really a good experience for me to kind of get my feet wet in the corporate world. Really neat because we had everything on campus, and we had a sushi chef and a gym on campus, and we also got these really cool Dell badges that we had to use when we went from room to room because everything was under high security. But I've always had a passion for the arts and also with music. So my dad was in the music business, and he's also a musician. So I knew I wanted to kind of get back to Los Angeles and back home. And so I got back to LA, and one of my really close friends had suggested that I look into public relations, that I would be really good at it. And I didn't know what public relations was. I didn't know what it entailed. So I started doing some research and researching various companies. And I saw that Rogers and Cowan had an opening. So I went and I applied for an office assistant receptionist job at Rogers and Cowan. And of course, didn't think I got the job, but 3 months later, they gave me a call and said I was hired. And it put me in a really great place because working in that position kind of allowed me to see things from a wider perspective. Without fully jumping into a publicity career. And the great thing was that we also shared space with Weber Shandwick and also with Octagon Management. So I got to meet a lot of really cool people and put faces to names and then kind of network before I got my feet wet. I was doing that for about a year and a half or so before Paul Block, the chairman of the company, asked me to go work on his desk because his assistant had left as she was going on vacation. And Paul was one of the biggest publicists of his time. He's a veteran publicist, and he had all these A-list clients. And of course, I was mortified, but I knew that I had to take the opportunity. So I think I did that for about a week, maybe even 2 weeks. And fast forward about 3 months later, his assistant got promoted to a publicist. And so first thing, he asked me to go work on his desk. The cool thing about Paul is that he really taught me how to deal with people. I mean, everybody loved him, and he was so good at what he did. And also just working on that level of clientele really helped me just take the dive into publicity and learn how to do it really well. I also got to see how the business was run because he was the chairman of the company. So I was able to see the deals coming in, how much money needed to be brought in, how to sign business. So about 2 years later, I started signing my own business, and that's when they promoted me to a full-time publicist over at Rogers and Cowan. At that point, they transferred me over to Alan Nierob's department, which he's also a really well-respected publicist and one of the biggest right now. He had really, really great clients as well. And I was able to kind of take the reins. He was able to provide me with some of his clients to work on. But one of them in particular, Rascal Flats, I was doing their tour press. And that's when I knew that I wanted to get into music. I was like, oh, okay, that's where I want to be. So I worked on Alan's department for a couple years before I left and went over to Gutman Associates. And Dick Gutman, he is also another veteran publicist. He was really close with both Paul and Alan, and he had some really, really amazing clients and also a lot of music clients. He had Barbra Streisand and Janet Jackson, but he also had some venues that I was able to do some showcases at and also get that production experience. It was kind of at that time when I was putting together showcases that I started talking to a lot of different managers, and we were sharing music. And one of them in particular that I had been sharing music with and talking with a lot had opened up his own management company, and he signed Timbaland. And so backtrack, I left Gutman very briefly to take a break in the entertainment business. I had just recently suffered a loss, and I was doing some work with animals and a few other things when I got a call from Timbaland's manager to come and work at the record label and also at the management company. So I went over there. I was there for about 4.5 years, working as vice president and also Timbaland's day-to-day manager. We worked on tons of exciting projects. It's really was a really unique experience for me. And we also recently worked on a new app, which I'm really grateful to get that experience on. And now I'm independently working as a manager and music publicist.
Wow. That's a really fascinating kind of career history you've had because you transitioned from a major company like Dell, who focuses obviously on tech. Then you kind of transitioned to doing some PR with some big firms in LA, in Beverly Hills. And then that kind of allowed you to transition into the music. I'm curious about how did that first leap from going to Dell and then going to Rogers and Cohen, how did your background with Dell and background as an account manager with them help or maybe hurt your first experiences working in public relations?
I think it really helped me because I was working business to business. I was working with a lot of large accounts. So when I went to a big firm like Rogers and Cowan, where I was also working with big clients, I felt like it kind of groomed me to have the right level of professionalism and also communication and also sales because publicity is a lot of selling. It's you're pitching your
Yeah.
clients, you're trying to get them into publications, and you're trying to get them media coverage. So I had that kind of background, so it felt a little bit more natural to me. I think the hardest learning curve for me in public relations was writing. Some people are just natural writers. They write, for various publications or they're editors and they also do public relations, but I've always been a strong writer, but I didn't feel like I was as strong as everybody else that was working there. So that
Yeah.
was something that I really had to focus on. There was a learning curve and I stayed pretty committed with it, but that was probably the hardest part about transitioning over into public relations was just
Yeah.
stepping up my writing game.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting because like working for Dell, you are selling computers, right? And then you transition to PR, and now you're selling people, right? You're selling people to brands. So that's kind of interesting that you kind of realize that. I kind of want to do a quick deep dive into public relations. If maybe someone's listening and they're not like too aware of even what an artist PR manager would be, so could you give like a short overview of what a PR manager would do for a musician?
Artist publicity is, really about maintaining an artist's image. It's also about spreading the word, spreading the news when they have a release or a project coming up. And it's a really important component of, the process because when you put out music or when you put out videos, you want your stuff to get seen. And so a publicist's job is really to kind of enhance the artist's image, get it into the right hands, a lot of pitching, a lot of great relationships with writers and editors, and just kind of managing their presence and making sure that they're still remaining engaged with their fans and telling their story behind all of those projects that they have coming up because that's a way that people like to engage with people as or with the artists and their fans. People want to know the story. They want to know what was behind the song or who is this person and how do I relate to them. So a publicist's job is pretty much telling that story on behalf of the artist.
Yeah, that's a really interesting role to have. I think that's fascinating, connecting those ties, creating the human behind the artist, right? And allowing those fans to feel like, they are a part of the artist and kind of vice versa. I'm curious now to kind of hear some things that you've maybe learned from working with these artists and being in those roles. And I know you would be working with not only the artists, but also the label, with also the brands, maybe some sponsorships they have. So, working with specifically the artist, how did you learn how to communicate effectively with them? Maybe what are some communication skills you did learn, and maybe things that you had difficulties with?
I think one of the biggest things I learned from working with artists in communication is patience, patience on both sides. Whenever you're in a relationship with somebody, whether that be a coworker or a client, Everybody has different communication styles. So it's really important to stay engaged and also have clear expectations with each other and have clear goals. And once everybody is on the same page and working towards a common goal, I think that that's when everybody gets more in sync. I think it's really important to stay engaged with artists and with your team.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it takes a high level of communication skills to be an effective PR manager. And that's exactly why I asked, because I'm sure that is like a really demanding thing. I'm curious about how your work as a PR manager has changed between the different artists you've worked with in terms of maybe a smaller artist versus a bigger superstar. Like, how would working with those artists really be different for you?
Yeah, there's definitely a major difference in more established superstars versus working with smaller artists that are emerging. When you're working with a major artist, they already have a lot that's already set in place for them. And you're really navigating and strategizing a lot of incoming opportunities. You may get tons and tons of people wanting to work with them all the time and wanting them to do this. And it's really navigating and figuring out which route to take. With emerging artists, just a really big push to get their story out there and to get them heard. And I think that's really the major difference that I see between working with the large artists versus working with emerging artists.
Yeah. So it's definitely sounds like, like working with the big artists is they've already kind of had like structures in place with like they're about this and a lot of the public knows like what they're about. And then working with the small artists, they kind of have more opportunities to brand themselves in different ways. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great place to be for independent artists because they're kind of also learning about the direction that they want to go. And yeah, so both just require a little bit different strategies. I wouldn't say that the workload is any different. It just requires a different pace and a different way of looking at things.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's like a lot of challenges like when you're first starting up. Is there any like what is the major thing that you think like small indie artists do in terms of PR that maybe isn't in their best interest?
Well, I think what does work in their best interest is when they have, a solid foundation that they've already built for themselves in terms of, the image that they've already built on socials, their websites, being able to access them easily and access their music easily. But also kind of knowing about how they want to be portrayed and the story that they want to tell and being comfortable talking to the media and doing interviews because it can be tough, and doing phoners and doing interviews. It's definitely challenging sometimes, especially for a busy artist, a busy working indie artist that might not have time to polish up on those types of skills. Practicing and kind of getting in the groove of talking about themselves and their stories and how they want to be portrayed to the public
Yeah.
is always good.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of artists, when they start out, maybe aren't focused on those things and like aren't focused on how they're portrayed. But then eventually it gets to that point to where they're like, oh, I am influencing these people and I am creating these things. Maybe I should be starting to think about how the public views me.
100%. And I think it's so important for artists to, they stay authentic to themselves. But like, again, I think it's just a matter of just human to human connection. And just fans always want to engage with the artist. So it's nice when they're able to share their experiences and they're able to share their stories and everything behind their music because it makes them feel more human to other people.
Yeah. Do you feel like your transition from working with public relations in different celebrities when you worked at Rogers and Cohen really changed when you went to like music PR? Did you work with like celebrities, for example, that weren't related to music? Was that a lot different, like establishing a public image than a musician?
Yeah, it was because it really depends on the project. When you're working in film publicity, it's a whole different ball game in terms of the way that film releases are structured. And when you're working with personalities that has a book coming out, it's a different strategy.
How are those like studios different than, let's say, if you're working with a musician working with their record label or working with their management?
I think working with an actor or an actress and working on, movies, you're working with, a movie studio and you're working with an entirely different team with an entirely different goals, with entirely different strategy. And then when you're working on the music side of things, well, it depends on if the band's touring or not, or the musician's touring or not. You've got tour press, or you're working on the releases with the record labels. So it's really just, different goals and different media.
So, Chantel, I'm kind of curious about your work, not only as a music manager, but like publicist, and then early on doing your PR work. How things have kind of changed in your take on the music industry today with the new technology and like the indie artist rise and the DIY kind of blueprint that a lot of musicians are taking now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it changes so much every single year. I mean, the landscape is always consistently changing. And I think with the digital age and with streaming and with all of these different, apps that a lot of even artist teams are building to have better control over their music, this is a huge shift away from, what you saw 25 years ago with a record label.
Absolutely.
It really is more artist friendly and it's becoming, I feel like the scale is becoming balanced. And I think it's going to continue to be that way. And I think it's great that, people can get their music out and they don't have to, they can do it on a distribution service or they can put it out on TikTok. I mean, it's awesome to see so many people creating. And I think we're only probably going to continue to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is like an evolving industry right now, like most industries, but especially within music, because we're seeing these technologies that I'm sure you weren't really thinking about having your artists have a hit record on TikTok 5 years ago because TikTok wasn't around.
100%. And I think you're going to just start seeing more and more technology like this coming out. Something I'm a huge fan of and that I'm really passionate about is the world of XR and all these virtual artists that are coming out, these virtual experiences. I think it really gives artists an opportunity to touch people in a novel way, not only to reach more people, but to involve more collaborators on the visual side. It's really cool and it's just going to keep going. And this is really an amazing time for breakthroughs in technology.
Absolutely. And like I've done a lot of work with Insomniac, and I was used to a year ago working 70,000 people festivals with them. And then once we saw events not happening over this past year, they definitely went online and they did the digital streaming stuff. So I'm curious about like your perspective on that, and like how do you think those virtual events or those virtual artists are like impacting the music industry today and going forward?
Well, I think we've all kind of had to adapt. I mean, it's been a difficult year and we've all had to adjust, but, not being face to face with people. But we have the technology available to be able to do these things. And we're already starting to see that, content is king. And I think really just finding new creative ways to reach people is really the big change right now. Is don't have to be in front of an audience live. You don't have to be in a meeting with people in a room. You can really do things remotely and you can really get things out there without having to, be physically present or, be physically at events. There's just so many different routes you can take. So I think as a manager and a publicist, I think it's a time to kind of get creative.
Yeah, most definitely. With your passion for virtual artists, I'm curious about how you as a manager or you as a publicist would kind of work differently under that kind of constraints of being virtual or being online. Like how would you as the manager and how are you adapting to these kind of changes?
I think everything we've all kind of had to adapt. Definitely difficult not being able to be face to face with people, but with things like Zoom and being able to communicate. Like I said before, it's just communication and kind of being creative in terms of strategy. Like you kind of have to adjust, and I've had to adjust on everything I'm working on. And
I think adjusting was like really important in the music industry because you always kind of want to be on the cutting edge. You always want to be innovative, whether you're the musician or whether you're the management. But now we're seeing we're in a time where like it's vital. Like you have to adapt, right? Like you have to kind of get with the times and get online if you weren't before, or start streaming if you weren't before. So I'm kind of curious about how you think managers will like maintain this kind of innovation, right? And like how managers will kind of take this innovation that's kind of necessary now and then like push it to the next level. Like how can you like keep your artists going forward if everyone is kind of doing this digital artistry?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that just because right now can be a really tricky time with everybody pushing out content and there's just so much to see. It can be overwhelming. It can be really tough to continue to stay engaged with your fan base and to spread your message. I think it's a mixture of, kind of thinking outside the box and being creative, but also having some sort of model to work from. You see it in esports. They modeled off of live events and live sporting events, and it's really worked for them because they utilized something that already was in place that was successful.
So I know you have worked in music management for the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm curious because I'm very interested in artist management. Like, what are some of the things that you've done that you have found are extremely successful for being a music manager? Because I know you talk about wearing all those hats and getting a lot of various different type of expertise and things such as licensing, marketing, public relations. How have those things like helped you be successful? And specifically, what are some things that helped with that success?
A few of the things that I've kind of learned from working in management over the past 4.5 years is think your network is really important. When I transitioned over from publicity to management, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know. And I felt like if you have the right people who are around you and supporting you, like there's been times when, oh my gosh, like there's a licensing thing coming in. I have a licensing question. I don't know exactly what to do here, or I need somebody to just take a look and make sure that this is okay. It's nice to have a contact, or I need an attorney for this deal. You got a contact. It's really important to build a good network. It's also really important to continuously be in a place of learning. I think in this industry, a lot of people walk around thinking they know everything, but it's such an ever changing landscape that, I think it's good to have an open mind and to keep learning because every situation is different and every situation there's sometimes can be done in a better way. I've had really good success on projects when I'm working with the right team and we have clear understanding of our goals and everybody has the right attitude.
Yeah. And that's really awesome that you have that like learning perspective, that constantly learning, which is why I kind of started this podcast, right? Because I want to help not only myself keep learning, but anyone else interested in these things to keep learning. I also like how you kind of touched on having that network and to reach out to a lot of people that are maybe have expertise in areas that you don't. So just like an artist might have a network of different musicians to collaborate on a song with, as the manager, you want to have connections within various aspects of the music industry to touch on and to kind of get that info. So that seems like a really important thing to
Yeah,
kind of
absolutely.
echo that.
And
Yeah.
you know what they say, your network is your net worth.
Yeah.
But I know I really felt like the people around me are the people that really helped when I was in that place and I was learning and I needed that expertise. I think building the right network is super important.
I guess since we're talking about some things to have success, if I wanted to become like a publicist or work as a PR manager for a musician, like how would I like get started in that? And like if you could go back, maybe like what experiences would you want to have like going into a career in the PR field?
I think that going into the PR field, you kind of need to have good communication skills, have good writing skills, have a lot of energy because publicity is definitely an all around the clock job. And also, I think it's good to know what kind of genre you want to get into and what kind of musical taste you have because I feel like anytime you're representing an artist or representing music, it's really important to really believe in it yourself because, like I said, it's at the end of the day, you're selling to a lot of people, and it's almost like you really have to be as enthusiastic about the music as the artist is in order to be, really successful.
Yeah,
So I
that's
think kind of
interesting. You have to like really believe in that. Like you can't fake it. Like I'm sure you didn't really meet a lot of like PR managers that you thought like genuinely didn't believe in that artist.
Exactly. I mean, you can always tell too, and it's always the successful campaigns and or the ones that have the great teams and they all believe in the same thing. And I think that's just it's important to kind of map out where you want to go. If you're just getting into PR, like kind of have an understanding, is it going to be music PR? Is it going to be film talent PR? Is it going to be, corporate PR? But if it's going to be music PR, like what are your interests and do you like rock? Do you like hip hop? Kind of narrow that down because that's going to make your job so much easier when you are in a genre and or working with music and working with artists that you're really inspired by.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, I would imagine like any salesperson has to believe in what they sell. So that seems pretty straightforward. Maybe now, like going towards the management end, because I know that's what you've been doing in the past couple of years. If I want to start being a music manager, what are some of like the things that you wish maybe you did and you knew before kind of getting into it?
I think having an entrepreneurial mindset is so important to management. And coming from a corporate world, I wasn't prepared for that in the beginning. And I think really starting on just having that mindset is so important when you go in because you're kind of going to get thrown the ball and then you have to figure out what to do with it and you have to be looking 2 steps ahead. I also think having good connections, I mean, understanding the business generally and then having good connections or at least trying to build your network of people, of mentors.
Yeah. So it's like really important once again to have people have a network and to keep in contact with those people you meet along the way, and I'm sure like go out of your shell, right? Like kind of branch out and maybe talk to some people that are making moves in the music industry, even if you're kind of uncertain about how they got there or like what they do exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to, be about it and don't be afraid and reach out because what you're going to find is that a lot of people that are successful in the music business have been in that same position that you were one day. And a lot of people are glad to help. And so I think that that's really important. And then obviously just taking as much time as you can to learn about everything. And also having a basic understanding of music and how it's broken down. It makes you a better communicator when you're communicating with your artist.
Okay. It's interesting. You kind of have to be like multilingual in the sense that you have to, when you're working as a manager, you have to be able to speak to an artist, but then you also have to be able to speak to other managers. You have to be able to speak to PR managers, corporation sponsors, all these different kind of people, perspectives. You have to learn how to speak to all of them in the way that they will reciprocate well.
Yeah, exactly. It definitely requires a high level skill of communication. And like I said before, just having the right people to kind of guide you is super important for learning that. And there's tons of great books and resources that you can find online these days too that kind of give you breakdown of the basic stuff involving a lot of the agreements and a lot of the things that a manager will deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I think really just getting in there and learning is the best way to kind of get your feet wet.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. Okay, I think we've talked about some really great stuff. I mean, we've gotten into the PR a little bit, we've gotten into the management a little bit. It sounds like you've like definitely had a lot of experience in different facets of the music industry. So I'm curious about like, is there any major like things you've learned that you could just share and like kind of shed light on some of this wisdom you have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this sounds general, but there's some important things that I feel like I've learned as I've gotten older and as I've had more experience, and especially speaking to people that are just getting started in their careers is one, don't be afraid to reach out to people to ask for help. And two, stay humble. And three, I think, it's good to be a leader, but sometimes you also got to be a follower. And I think that that's really important when you're dealing with a lot of different people in the music business.
Yeah.
You want to have an open mind.
Yeah. All three of those things kind of like worked together with each other, right? So like in order to have a good network and like know all these people, like you said, is very valuable. You have to like be humble in yourself and then know to approach them and speak with people. And I know I've had guests on this podcast that really stress the importance of being genuine and being nice to people. So it seems
Mhm.
like that's also a really big case of like if you're starting out in the music industry, you have to learn how to genuinely approach people, spread that network, be humble within yourself, and then once you kind of have those contacts, you can start reaching out to people and you can kind of start making actually business happen, right? Making some money once you've kind of
Mhm.
established those qualities.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, Chantel. I think we really accumulated a lot of good knowledge here in this episode because we talked about your work not only at a major tech company like Dell and like how you transitioned from working with them to like working within music as a PR manager. And I appreciate you kind of breaking down what public relations really entails within the music industry, because I feel like that's a career not a lot of people think about, is that there is a team of people behind artists that kind of make us think about them in a certain light. So I appreciate you going into detail about that, as well as your work within music management, because we're seeing a really pivotal time within music right now. And I think your past 4 or 5 years of working within music management has kind of allowed you to see these kind of hectic changing times in an interesting light. So I appreciate you kind of breaking that down. I want to thank you for coming on, but before we kind of leave, I want to ask you, is there anything you feel like we didn't touch on enough and you kind of want to expand on shortly? Or is there anything that we totally didn't talk about that you kind of want to talk about before we end here?
No, I think we touched on everything, and I thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chantal. I really want to thank you for coming onto the show because it means a whole lot to me.
Thanks, Vincent.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, that wraps up another episode of Behind the Pulse. If you enjoyed this one, please like and subscribe. I appreciate all the support I've gotten so far. I got a bunch of great episodes coming soon. Peace.